So under some conditions, there's organisms that will have to survive when oxygen is either totally absent or very low. For organisms that always live in conditions that have no oxygen, they often have evolved a process called anaerobic respiration. And in anaerobic respiration, they're going to use something other than O2 as the final electron acceptor. So they'll have a process very similar to ours, but at the bottom of the electron transport chain, they'll have something like a sulfur compound or something else that will be the final electron acceptor. This is present in things like bacteria. The other strategy for surviving conditions that are either missing or low in oxygen is to carry out only glycolysis. Because glycolysis has no direct oxygen requirement. Remember that oxygen is needed in oxidative phosphorylation. And so the cell will have a way to do just glycolysis. It will have to carry out an additional reaction, and we'll talk about why that is in a sec. But there's two types. The pyruvate that's made at the end of glycolysis will be converted to lactic acid in our muscles, as an example, and that's called lactic acid fermentation. Or it's converted to ethanol, and that's called alcohol fermentation, and that's what yeasts do. So again, this is called fermentation. It produces a lot less ATP. So it's only going to produce 2 ATP per glucose. Remember that cellular respiration produces 34 to 38 ATP. So it's a lot less efficient. So fermentation is really glycolysis plus an extra set of reactions that regenerate NAD. So glycolysis doesn't have a direct requirement for oxygen, so it can make those 2 ATP even when oxygen is not present. But remember that one of the other things that happens during glycolysis is that NAD+ is reduced to NADH. So a raw material, an input that's required for glycolysis, is glucose, but it's also NAD+. Okay? So in normal cellular respiration, how do we get that NAD+? Where does this input come from? Well, remember in the oxidative phosphorylation pathway, the NADH is converted back to NAD+. So in normal cellular respiration, this will go back to glycolysis. If oxidative phosphorylation is not occurring because there's no oxygen, then I'm not making the NAD+ that I need for glycolysis. So fermentation will have to have a different way to make NAD+. Right? So it's glycolysis, which is going to make the ATP, but then it also needs an extra reaction that's going to take NADH and convert it back to NAD+, because oxidative phosphorylation is not occurring without oxygen. So, I feel like a broken record, but fermentation is glycolysis that makes 2 ATPs, plus you have to have a whole set of separate reactions that make NAD+ from NADH. So again, taking NADH and converting it back to NAD+. There's 2 different ways to do this. In alcohol fermentation, the pyruvate that's made at the end of glycolysis is going to go through 2 reactions. One that produces 2 carbons and a CO2. So it's going to release CO2 just like cellular respiration, but it's not. It's fermentation, okay? And people get confused there. So it'll first release a CO2, and then there'll be a redox reaction where this molecule is reduced to alcohol or ethanol. And at the same time, because remember they always go together, NADH is oxidized back to NAD+. So that is the first type, alcohol fermentation. Pyruvate is broken down into a 2-carbon molecule and CO2. The 2-carbon molecule is reduced to ethanol, and the NADH is oxidized to NAD+. In lactic acid fermentation, there's only one reaction where the pyruvate is the pyruvate is reduced and NADH is oxidized at the same time. Remember, they always go together. The pyruvate becomes lactic acid and the NADH becomes NAD+. Lactic acid fermentation occurs in our muscles. So why would muscles need to carry out fermentation? Well, think about when you're exercising. When you're exercising vigorously, your needs for energy increase. And so to accommodate that needs for energy, your cell starts carrying out more cellular respiration. Well, in order to carry out more cellular respiration, you start breathing heavier because you're needing to bring in more oxygen and get rid of more CO2. And your heart starts beating faster to get that oxygen to your cells faster. But even with all those changes that are trying to help your cells carry out cellular respiration really fast, it can still outpace the use of energy. So as your muscles are really working hard, they're using energy faster than they can get oxygen. As that starts to happen, your muscles become a low oxygen environment. So again, because the muscles are burning so much energy, they end up having low O2. Now, you're working out, so they still need energy. So in order to get that energy, they will switch to lactic acid fermentation. They'll have to take the pyruvate and carry out the redox reaction where they produce lactic acid and NAD+. And in fact, some of muscle soreness is caused by lactic acid buildup. So the kind of burning feeling in your muscles is muscle soreness, and that will eventually go away as the lactic acid gets reabsorbed by your body. Yeast are organisms that are called facultative anaerobes. Yeast. That means that they can carry out cellular respiration or they can carry out fermentation if the conditions don't have oxygen. So humans manipulate this by putting yeast into low oxygen environments. So this is a cask, and by sealing the cask, this creates a low O2 environment. In the case of bread, where this also occurs, the dough, which is the thick flour paste, doesn't let oxygen in, so it also creates a low oxygen environment. When the yeast are put into the low oxygen environment, they'll simply switch to fermentation. So they'll take the pyruvate, break it down into CO2 and acetaldehyde, which is that 2-carbon molecule, and then they'll carry out the redox reaction where they oxidize the acetaldehyde and switch that. NADH is oxidized to NAD+, and the acetaldehyde is reduced. So let me write that there for you because I misspoke there. So the NADH is oxidized. And so this creates the ethanol that is a product of yeast. So this guy's making wine here. This is how beer is made. In the old days, it was also how it was carbonated. The CO2 would carbonate the beer. Today, it's not done that way usually, but that was how it was in the old days. And you can actually make homemade soda with yeast if you don't let the fermentation go long. So same thing with bread. Bread rises because of the CO2 that's being trapped from fermentation. And it makes a very small amount of ethanol because you're not letting the reaction go. Like a beer would ferment for 2 weeks or a wine for a year or more, whereas bread, of course, is only a couple of hours, so you're not getting a ton of ethanol. And that ethanol bakes out anyway from the heat of the oven. So these are the 2 types of fermentation. So muscle cells, I just want to come back to lactic acid fermentation for a second and address something that's confusing sometimes to people. Muscle cells are the only cells in our body that can carry out lactic acid fermentation. Your brain, if it doesn't have enough oxygen, brain cells just die, as you probably know. That's one of the first places that cells will die if somebody's without oxygen, which is why going without oxygen can cause brain damage even if somebody survives. So this, people wonder, well, why would we have lactic acid fermentation in our muscles but not in our brains? Well, if you think about the evolutionary process, this is really not that surprising. Our muscles would have experienced frequent low oxygen conditions, and so that created an opportunity for selection and evolution of a chemical process that could make those muscle cells survive. If you think back to our ancestors, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, a low oxygen condition in the brain was really a very freak event that almost always ended in death. And so when it's a very rare event that ends in death, there's no chance for evolution to select for any change in the brain cells. So that's why only our muscles can do lactic acid fermentation, and why for the most part we are very dependent on having a good supply of oxygen, which is why our lungs and hearts need to work well. So just going to go through some questions about fermentation here. So if you think about the NADH generated during glycolysis, those electrons, remember NAD plus is accepting electrons when it's reduced, so an electron is going in. So the question is, where does that electron end up? In cellular respiration, so if you think to cellular respiration, the electrons end up in oxygen. So oxygen is the final electron acceptor at the bottom of oxidative phosphorylation. In fermentation, the whole problem is that there is no oxygen to accept that electron. So instead, pyruvate becomes the final electron acceptor. So pyruvate has to take those electrons so that NADH can go back to being NAD+. So the electrons are going to leave and go to pyruvate. Second question here is about glucose consumption. So if a yeast cell is eating glucose and it's living in an aerobic environment, that means an environment that has oxygen, and you move it to an anaerobic environment, that means an environment without oxygen, how would what the yeast eats have to change, right? So in order to keep making ATP at the same rate, how will it need to change the amount of glucose that it eats? In order to answer this question, we need to remind ourselves about the amount of ATP that's produced in the different environments. So if oxygen is present, the yeast can make 34 to 38 ATP. And just for simplicity, let's make that an average of 36 ATP. In low oxygen conditions, the cell will have to carry out fermentation, where it only makes 2 ATP per glucose. Add the per glucose here. So that's a lot less. In order for it to make 36 ATP, it would now have to use 18 glucoses. How did I get that number? Well, 18 times 2 is equal to 36 ATP. So it would have to increase its glucose consumption 18 times. So it's going to burn through sugar much faster. And if you think about alcohol fermentation, when you start making wine or beer, you start with something that's very, very, very sweet. So grape juice in the case of wine, malt extract, which is a very sweet, sugary liquid in the case of beer. Those are very sweet, but the yeast are going to go through that sugar really fast because they're having to carry out so much fermentation. And so the end product is not very sweet at all. So they definitely need more food if they're going to carry out fermentation, but they'll be able to survive the low oxygen environment.